Chapter 1. The Mirror at Morley Court. It was a cold October morning when Hercule Poirot, resplendent in a grey suit with his moustaches waxed to perfection, found himself standing on the gravel drive of Morley Court. The sky above was a uniform slab of lead, the kind that foretold drizzle rather than storm. The countryside around him lay in muted silence, a patchwork of withered hedgerows and decaying leaves. He turned to his companion, Captain Arthur Hastings, who had just emerged from the car, stretching stiff limbs from the long journey from London. "See, mon ami," Poirot murmured, "when one is invited to the countryside for a quiet consultation, it is never truly quiet, is it?" Hastings chuckled, brushing off the sleeves of his coat. "Well, you've only yourself to blame, Poirot. You could have refused Lady Morley's invitation." "No," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "One does not refuse an invitation from a woman who writes, in careful ink, that she is deeply disturbed by something that no one else sees. That is when one becomes curious." Morley Court was a fine but austere house, Jacobean in structure, with tall windows and sombre gables. It stood isolated among blackened yews and chestnuts that had long since ceased to be tended with care. A disused fountain, moss-covered and crumbling, sat at the entrance like a relic of forgotten wealth. The door was opened not by a butler, but by a maid, a young woman in a plain uniform, her eyes quick and intelligent. "Monsieur Poirot, Lady Morley is expecting you. Please come in." The entrance hall bore that peculiar smell of old wood, dried lavender, and disuse. A thin carpet ran across the stone floor, and on either side were dark portraits, some cracked, others only half lit by the struggling daylight. They were shown into a drawing-room that seemed equally as faded as the rest of the house. A fire had been lit, though it offered more suggestion of warmth than any real heat. On the mantelpiece stood a mirror, its frame of dark oak, and at its base an inscription etched in silver. "What you see, you own. What you deny, you lose." Poirot's gaze lingered on it a moment before Lady Morley entered. She was in her early 60s, slim and tall, dressed in a mourning grey ensemble with a brooch that bore the Morley crest. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, dominated by shrewd eyes and a mouth that suggested discipline and discretion. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot," she said at once, motioning for them to sit. "I apologize for the urgency in my letter, but I believe something very wrong has happened in this house." Poirot inclined his head. "You have my attention, madam. Perhaps you would begin at the beginning." Lady Morley folded her hands. "It concerns the mirror on that mantelpiece." Hastings looked over. "Seems like a perfectly ordinary mirror to me." "Exactly," Lady Morley said. "And yet it is not. That mirror has been in this house for over 200 years. It is part of the house's history, supposedly carved by one of my ancestors after the death of his young bride. But 3 nights ago I saw something impossible, my late husband's face in it." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Your husband is deceased?" "5 years ago. Colonel Geoffrey Morley. A riding accident, a very public funeral." Her voice did not falter. "And yet," Poirot said gently, "you believe you saw him?" "Yes, it was unmistakable. I came into the room late in the evening. The fire was dying. I crossed to the writing desk, and as I turned, I caught sight of the mirror. There, clear as anything, was Geoffrey's reflection, though he was not in the room. Poirot leaned forward. "And you are sure it was not a trick of the light? A shadow? I know my husband's face, Monsieur Poirot. He had a scar under his left eye from a bayonet wound. The reflection showed it. Even the way he smiled, half sardonic, half curious. It wasn't light, it was something else." There was a silence. And then Poirot asked. I blinked. I turned. He was gone. I told myself I was tired, imaginative, but the next morning— She paused. "The next morning I found something in this room, a silver cigarette case. It had Geoffrey's initials, but it was not in the family collection. It was warm, as if recently held." Poirot looked toward the fire. "You have not touched this mirror since then?" he asked. "No. I had the room locked. Only Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper, has the key." "And has anything else occurred since?" Lady Morley hesitated. "That same night, one of our guests reported hearing footsteps in the east wing. That part of the house has been unoccupied for months. She said she heard someone weeping, quietly, as if in mourning." Poirot's eyes drifted once again to the engraving on the mirror. "What you see, you own." Lady Morley followed his gaze. "It's an old family motto. No one knows who originally carved it, but many in the family say the mirror has watched things, that it reveals the truth in its own fashion." Hastings cleared his throat politely. "Forgive me, Lady Morley, but this all sounds frightfully Gothic." She smiled thinly. "I know how it sounds, Captain Hastings, but something is wrong in this house. And now I am no longer the only one to feel it. My niece Eleanor, she's seen things too, heard whispers in the hall, and this is the worst part. 2 days ago, she found an old letter in the library, addressed to Geoffrey, posted after his death." There was a pause. Poirot's expression was unreadable. "You still have this letter?" he asked. "I do. I've kept it in my desk, but I haven't read it. I was afraid. Afraid it might prove something I don't want to believe." Poirot stood and walked to the mirror. He examined the wood, the inscription, the glass itself. Then he turned back to Lady Morley. "May I see the letter?" She nodded and left the room, returning moments later with a yellowed envelope. It was addressed in thick ink to Colonel Geoffrey Morley, Morley Court, and bore a postmark dated 2 weeks after his death. Hastings whistled softly. Poirot accepted the letter delicately, using his handkerchief. He did not open it yet, but turned it over carefully, inspecting it for tampering. Then he placed it gently on the table. "One must be very careful with ghosts," he said quietly. "They are often the inventions of the living." Lady Morley drew herself up. "You don't believe me." "On the contrary, madame," Poirot said, "I believe that something very real has occurred here. Whether it involves the supernatural or the psychological, that is what we are here to uncover." Hastings glanced around the dim room. "You've other guests at present?" "Yes, my niece Eleanor, as I mentioned, a Mr. Adrian Forsyth, an art historian, and Dr. Simon Merriweather, an old friend of my husband's. They arrived a week ago for the annual harvest gathering, a tradition we've kept even since Geoffrey's death." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then I would like to meet each of them, one by one. But first, may I ask to see the East Wing?" Lady Morley hesitated. "There's little to see. The wing has been unused for some time. The rooms are shuttered." "Even so," Poirot said, "sometimes it is in the neglected corners of a house that truth resides." Lady Morley rose. "Very well. But please, Monsieur Poirot, if what I saw was not a ghost, then I fear it was something worse. A warning or a trap." Poirot offered a gentle bow. "Let us begin, madam. Mirrors reveal more than faces. They reflect motives, secrets, and perhaps even murder." Chapter 2 will continue as Poirot explores the East Wing and meets the house's guests. Let me know when you're ready to proceed. Chapter 2. Shadows in the East Wing Morley Court had once boasted over 30 rooms, but time and dwindling fortunes had closed off entire sections of the house like forgotten pages in a book. The East Wing was one such chapter, unused, unlit, and almost unloved. With Lady Morley's permission, Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings set off that afternoon to examine it. The maid, Clara, led them down the main hall, past faded tapestries and a long line of ancestral portraits, until they reached a narrow passage behind the library. A heavy oak door marked the threshold of the East Wing. Clara hesitated. "No, one's been here in months, sir. At least not that we've been told." "You keep it locked?" asked Poirot. "Yes, sir. Lady Morley keeps the key in her desk. Only she and Mrs. Weatherby ever go in." Poirot nodded. "And yet, mademoiselle, someone has been here, I think, recently." He opened the door with a faint creak, and a rush of stale, cold air greeted them. The corridor beyond was narrow, lined with high windows, shuttered from within. Their footsteps echoed on the floorboards as they proceeded, light from Hastings's torch flickering along the walls. Dust lay in thick layers, disturbed only by faint scuff marks. Someone had walked here. Poirot stopped suddenly. There. Gertrude pointed to a shallow indentation in the dust, an oval shape just ahead. Hastings knelt and examined it. "A heel print," he said. "Small. A woman's shoe, perhaps." Poirot tilted his head. "Not necessarily. The sole is narrow, yes, but the depth of the impression speaks of weight. Possibly a man with light footwear. Or someone deliberately trying to appear light." They moved on. The corridor ended in a small sitting room, its windows shuttered, but with a thread of light leaking through a gap in the wood. The fireplace was unused, though a few flecks of black ash clung to the grate. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he walked to the hearth. "Regardez," he said. A cigarette, burnt halfway, and then stubbed out hastily. Hastings frowned. "And Lady Morley said no one had been in here." Poirot delicately picked up the stub with his handkerchief and sniffed it. "Egyptian blend. Not a common brand, mon ami. A taste either of someone cultured or someone pretending to be." He turned toward the window and tugged back the curtain. "Hastings, look, the pane was streaked with condensation, but a small patch had been wiped clean recently. Someone had been watching from this room, watching the garden below. What would they be watching for?" Hastings asked. Poirot straightened. "A signal, a person, or perhaps the drawing-room. That mirror is clearly visible from here if one knows where to look. A secret observer? Exactly." They explored the adjoining rooms, most empty save for sheets over furniture and the musty smell of abandonment. In one guest bedroom, however, Poirot discovered a curious object. A small child's glove, half tucked beneath the bed. He held it up. "This is not old, and the dust around it is disturbed. A child has been here recently." "But there are no children in the house," Hastings said slowly. "None that Lady Morley mentioned." Poirot replied, his tone thoughtful, "And yet the evidence speaks. A child, a smoker, someone who watches in secret, and someone who, perhaps, wishes to remain unmentioned." They returned to the drawing-room just before tea. Lady Morley was seated by the fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. "You've returned," she said, and Poirot inclined his head. "There are signs of recent occupation in the east wing." Her lips tightened. "I feared as much." "Tell me, madam, was there ever a child who stayed in that part of the house? Someone hidden, perhaps?" Lady Morley looked startled. Then her expression shifted, becoming guarded. "There was, once," she said slowly. "Many years ago. My late husband had a ward, his goddaughter. Her name was Elise. She lived with us for a time after her parents died, but she ran away at 16. I've not heard of her since." Poirot's gaze was sharp. "She would be, how old now? Mid-30s, I imagine. And you have reason to believe she may have returned." Lady Morley hesitated. "None. But if she has, why return in secret?" Poirot nodded. "That, Lady Morley, is precisely the question I intend to answer." Later that afternoon, Poirot and Hastings were formally introduced to the remaining guests. Eleanor Morley, Lady Morley's niece, was a pale, introspective young woman in her mid-20s. She greeted Poirot politely, but with an edge of nervousness. There was a vague unease in her demeanour, as though she were constantly suppressing some inner tension. "I understand you've experienced disturbances," Poirot said gently. She nodded. "I heard footsteps 2 nights ago, and soft crying. It seemed to come from the corridor near the east wing. I thought at first it might be the wind, but—" She paused. "There was something sorrowful in it, not natural." "Had you been drinking?" Hastings asked, perhaps a little too bluntly. She flushed. "No, I was reading in bed, and I'm not one to imagine things, Captain Hastings." Poirot interjected smoothly. "And you have not seen anything? In mirrors, perhaps?" Her face went pale. "Why would you ask that?" "Because someone else has." She swallowed and looked away. Poirot let the silence linger. The next guest was Adrian Forsyth, an elegant man with perfectly parted hair and an accent tinged with Cambridge, an art historian of some repute. He had come to Morley Court to examine old family heirlooms. "The mirror is exquisite," he said when asked. 17th century, I believe. Oak frame, with an engraving technique that predates most known. English examples quite rare. And do you believe it has supernatural qualities?" Forsyth chuckled. "Monsieur Poirot, I believe in brushstrokes and patinas, not phantoms. That said, some objects do seem to absorb emotion over the years, like a painting retaining the sadness of its sitter. Perhaps mirrors do something similar. You have not seen anything unusual?" He smiled politely. "Only my own reflection, thank heaven." The final guest was Dr. Simon Merriweather, a man in his 50s with bristly eyebrows and the kind of handshake that spoke of army discipline. He had known Colonel Morley since their days in India. Geoffrey was a hard man, but fair. Said, "A soldier's soldier." "Do you believe in ghosts, Doctor?" Poirot asked. "Not for a moment. But I believe in guilt and grief. Both can haunt a house far more effectively than spirits." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "And who, in your view, bears grief in this house?" The doctor hesitated. "Eleanor, perhaps. She was always sensitive. But if you ask me, there's more to Lady Morley than meets the eye. She's been strained lately." Poirot inclined his head. The evening passed in an uneasy quiet after dinner. Poirot lingered in the drawing-room long after the others had retired. The fire burned low. The engraved mirror caught the flickering light and seemed almost alive with motion. Poirot rose and approached it, studying the engraving once more. What you see, you own. What you deny, you lose. He spoke softly, as if to the mirror itself. Wonder. Who is it that sees but dares not admit what they know? Just then, a floorboard creaked behind him. Poirot turned, but no one was there. Only the soft hush of the curtains and the hollow silence of Morley Court. Chapter 3. The Ward, Who Vanished. The following morning broke with a drizzle that misted the windows and turned the garden paths to glistening threads. Poirot was already seated at the breakfast table when Hastings joined him, the latter still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Any new revelations in the night?" Hastings asked through a yawn. Poirot, who was methodically slicing a boiled egg, shook his head. "Only that the mirror has begun to trouble more than just Lady Morley. Did you see Miss Eleanor last night?" "Yes," Hastings replied, helping himself to toast. "She looked frightfully pale, as if she'd seen something herself." "Or remembered something," Poirot murmured. "There is something unspoken there, something she has chosen not to share." He tapped the spoon on his egg. "I have been thinking, Hastings. This ward, Elise, she vanished at 16. Ran away, Lady Morley said. That is not an ordinary occurrence in a house like this." "Well," Hastings offered, "a girl that age might have had a quarrel. Or perhaps a romance. Ah, you think romantically, mon ami, but I think of motive. If Elise was raised in this house, she knew its people, its rhythms, its secrets. To vanish suddenly, and then perhaps to return in silence. That is the gesture of someone with unfinished business." After breakfast, Poirot requested a meeting with Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper. She arrived promptly in the morning room, a woman of sturdy build and resolute expression. Her greying hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to raise her eyebrows permanently. "Mrs. Weatherby," Poirot began gently, "you have been with the Morley family a long time. 37 years, sir," she said with pride. "Since Lady Morley was still Mrs. Geoffrey Morley. Then perhaps you knew the young lady who once lived here, Elise." Mrs. Weatherby's expression shifted, just for a moment. Her lips compressed, and her gaze flicked towards the closed door before returning to Poirot. "I did. What can you tell me about her?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. Elise was a strange child, quiet, watched more than she spoke. She was clever, no doubt about that. But she didn't fit in here. Not really. The Colonel tried to raise her properly, but she trailed off, yes. She would disappear for hours, into the woods, the attics, the old chapel, places no one else used. She said she liked to listen to the house breathing. Her tone made clear what she thought of that. And her departure? It was sudden. Mrs. Weatherby stiffened. She left one morning without a word, packed a bag, left her room neat as a pin. We didn't even know she was gone until the evening. No note? No, at least not to my knowledge. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Weatherby, did anyone in the house seem relieved by her disappearance? The housekeeper hesitated. Lady Morley was upset. But the Colonel, well, he didn't speak of her again. Not once. Poirot studied her. And you? Mrs. Weatherby's voice dropped. If you ask me, Mr. Poirot, Elise knew something she shouldn't have. She saw things, heard things, and someone didn't want her here because of it. Poirot returned to the drawing-room, deep in thought. Hastings trailed behind him. "Do you think Elise has really come back?" Hastings asked. "I think someone wants us to believe that," Poirot replied. "But the question is whether Elise herself is the architect of this game, or merely its shadow." They found Lady Morley reading by the fire. She looked up as they entered. "Lady Morley," Poirot said, "I must trouble you with a difficult question. When Elise left, did your husband truly make no attempt to find her?" There was a pause before she answered. "None. He refused to speak of her. He called it a betrayal of his generosity. I think he was wounded, or perhaps frightened." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Frightened, madam." She looked away. "You didn't know Geoffrey. He was proud, yes, but also superstitious. He once told me Elise had an old soul, that she saw things other people shouldn't. One night, he returned from his study shaking. He said Elise had stood in the corridor, just staring at him, silent. He claimed she whispered something, but he would never say what." Poirot's eyes glinted. "And what do you believe?" "I think Elise was clever, and that cleverness was uncomfortable in a house built on tradition and silence. Do you have a photograph of her?" Lady Morley hesitated, then rose and fetched a slim album from the writing desk. She opened it carefully and removed a small photograph, slightly faded with time. It showed a girl of about 14, dark hair, pale eyes, and a guarded expression. Even in stillness, there was something observant in her face. Poirot studied it. "Merci, madame." That afternoon, Poirot requested to see the library. Clara led them in, unlocking the tall doors to reveal a chamber filled with the scent of leather bindings and dust. Rows-off books climbed to the high ceiling, and a wrought-iron spiral staircase curled up to a mezzanine above. "This is where Miss Eleanor found the letter?" Poirot asked. "Yes, sir," Clara said. "She said it slipped out of an old volume of military speeches." Poirot gestured toward the shelves, and the letter was addressed to Colonel Morley, dated after his death. "Yes." Poirot walked slowly along the spines, then stopped before a glass cabinet near the far wall. Inside were items of military memorabilia, medals, a ceremonial dagger, and an ornate compass with the initials G on the shelf above. Something had been recently disturbed, a book misaligned among its neighbours. Poirot pulled it out gently. Inside the cover was a faint watermark from something recently removed, "The letter was here," he said softly, "and not forgotten. No, no, it was placed for someone to find." "Planted?" Hastings asked. Poirot nodded. "Perhaps even forged. But why? To raise suspicion, to suggest that Colonel Morley's death is not quite what it seemed." They turned to leave when Poirot paused near the library fireplace. A small box had been half hidden behind a set of fire-irons. He picked it up. It was a box of matches, silver-tipped, embossed with a hotel's name, the Harrowbridge Inn, Oxfordshire. Poirot turned it over. "Curious," he murmured. "A guest has recently been somewhere they do not admit." At dinner that evening, Poirot turned to Eleanor with the gentle probing of a master watchmaker. "You are fond of reading, mademoiselle?" She nodded. "Very much. I spend most of my time in the library. And the military volumes," she hesitated. "Not especially. But that book, the one with the letter, I pulled it because something looked odd. The pages had been tampered with. I thought it was just damaged." Poirot smiled kindly. "And did you read the letter?" "No, only the name. I felt like I'd stumbled onto something private. I gave it straight to Aunt Hester." "You have been here before, no?" "Yes, every autumn, since I was a child." "Do you remember Elise?" There was a pause. "Only vaguely. I was 7 when she disappeared. I remember her brushing my hair once. She had cold hands, but kind." Poirot nodded. "And tell me, mademoiselle, have you heard anyone else speak of her recently?" Eleanor's gaze flicked to her plate. "Only Mrs. Weatherby. She said I look like her, sometimes." "And do you?" Eleanor met his eyes. "I don't know, but I've dreamt of her lately. I can't explain why." That night the rain fell heavier, and the wind scraped the windows of Morley Court like fingernails. Poirot lay awake for a time, then rose quietly, dressed and walked the house with soft steps. He returned to the east wing and made his way to the old sitting-room. The ashes in the grate were now gone. Poirot smiled faintly. "Someone is cleaning up." He turned and examined the wall behind the mirror. There, half hidden by a cabinet, was a small discoloured panel, wood darker than the rest. He tapped it, hollow. With care, he pressed the edges. It gave way with a faint click. A narrow cupboard revealed itself. Inside were several old papers, and a photograph. The same girl from Lady Morley's album, Elise, but older, in her 20s, standing beside Colonel Morley. But something in her eyes had changed. A quiet sorrow, and tucked behind it, a second envelope. This one was addressed, not to Colonel Morley, but to Lady Hester Morley. And on the back, in faded ink, a single word was written, "Confession." Poirot stared at it for a long moment, then closed the cupboard and slipped the envelope into his coat. As he stepped back into the hall, a sound reached his ear, soft, barely audible. A child's voice, laughing, then silence. Chapter 4. A Confession. Industrier Hercule Poirot stood at the edge of the corridor in the east wing, the envelope still clutched in his hand, the echoes of the child's laughter fading into silence. The house had returned to stillness, but a subtle tension had tightened around its walls, a sense of something awakening, of past and present beginning to collide. He did not open the letter at once. Instead, he returned quietly to his room and placed the envelope beneath the blotter on his writing desk. There would be time, and more importantly, the right moment to read it. In Poirot's mind, the unravelling of a mystery was as delicate as a surgical procedure. Timing, always, was paramount. By morning, the storm had passed. Mist hung low in the garden, and the trees dripped softly in the hush of early light. Poirot descended to the breakfast-room to find Lady Morley already seated, her eyes shadowed by a night of poor sleep. He bowed slightly as he approached her chair. "Madame," he said gently, "forgive me, but I must ask, did your husband ever confide in you about Elise? Did he ever speak of a confession or a letter?" Lady Morley's teacup trembled slightly as she set it down. "No," she said slowly. "Geoffrey was not a man who confessed. He was a soldier. Discipline, silence, and pride were his currency." Poirot nodded, and yet he may have left something behind, perhaps not in words spoken aloud, but in documents concealed. Lady Morley stiffened. "Have you found something?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I believe we are on the threshold, madam. But I must tread carefully. If what I suspect is true, then this house has kept a secret buried longer than anyone knew." She looked at him then, directly. "Do you believe Elise is still alive?" Poirot paused. "It is a possibility, but I am more interested in who believes she has returned, and why." Later that morning, Poirot summoned Eleanor to the drawing-room. She arrived reluctantly, a book clutched in one hand. She wore a dark blue sweater, and her hair was pinned back simply, but her eyes were ringed with sleeplessness. "You wished to see me, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oui, mademoiselle. Sit, if you please." She complied, and he studied her carefully before speaking. "You said yesterday that Elise brushed your hair once, that her hands were cold." Eleanor nodded, confused, "and that you have dreamt of her." "Yes, several times since I arrived. She stands at the end of my bed, just watching." "Do you feel she is real?" Eleanor hesitated. "I feel she is trying to say something, but I can't hear it. Every time I wake, there's this feeling, like I've forgotten something terribly important." Poirot nodded slowly. "Eleanor, if Elise were alive, truly alive, and in this house now, what would you do?" She looked startled. I don't know. I think I'd ask her why she left, if she's angry, if she remembers me." Poirot reached into his pocket and produced the photograph of Elise, older than the one Lady Morley had shown. Eleanor took it, her breath catching. "This is her," she said. "But older. Where did you find this?" "In a hidden cupboard in the east wing," Poirot said, "and this was behind it." He handed her the second envelope, the one marked Confession. Her fingers trembled. "Should I open it?" Poirot shook his head. "Not yet, but I wished for you to see it. You may be more connected to Elise than you realize." "What do you mean?" He studied her carefully. "Perhaps nothing, or perhaps everything." Meanwhile, Hastings had taken to interviewing Adrian Forsyth, who was sketching in the rose garden despite the damp. "You seem untroubled by all this ghost business," Hastings said, not without suspicion. Forsyth looked up and smiled. "I've stayed in enough old houses to know they all come with a few rattling bones. Frankly, I find it rather thrilling. Like being inside one of those penny dreadfuls." "You've travelled a great deal?" Hastings asked. "Indeed. My specialty is Baroque engravings and early ecclesiastical iconography. I've seen more faded angels and cracked halos than I can count." You ever been to the Harrowbridge Inn in Oxfordshire? Forsyth paused. Harrowbridge? I stayed there briefly last month. Lovely old place. Why? Hastings didn't reply, but tucked the confirmation away for Poirot. The matchbox had been Forsyth's then. And what did you think of Colonel Morley? Hastings asked casually. Forsyth's face grew serious. Never met him. But his portrait in the study gives one the impression of a man who kept his emotions in a locked drawer. I imagine Elise must have rattled him. You knew about Elise. Lady Morley mentioned her once. Said she was a lost soul. Aren't we all? Back inside, Poirot finally opened the envelope marked Confession. The ink was faded but legible, the writing slow and deliberate. It was unsigned but clearly penned by Colonel Geoffrey Morley. There are things I have done which shame me, things no soldier's code or gentleman's name can justify. Elise was never a burden. She was truth incarnate. She saw through us all, and for that I hated her. She discovered what I did. In Cairo, in the spring of 1907, I told myself she would forget, but she did not. And so I sent her away, not with words, but with fear. I frightened her into leaving. May God forgive me. Poirot folded the letter carefully. There was no detail of the crime itself, only the shame. But it was enough. Elise had seen something unspeakable, and Colonel Morley had driven her out. The next step, Poirot knew, was to determine whether she had truly returned, or whether someone else was using her memory to manipulate the present. That evening, Lady Morley hosted a small gathering in the drawing-room. Candles flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Dr. Merriweather entertained with tales of colonial India, while Eleanor sat silently by the fire. Forsyth poured himself a brandy, the picture of composure. Poirot watched them all. Then he stood. Mesdames et messieurs, he said softly, I believe it is time to reveal what I have learned. Everyone looked up. I believe that Elise Morley is not only alive, but has been in this house in recent days. Lady Morley's hand went to her mouth. Poirot continued, I believe she has returned not for revenge, but for clarity, for justice. Something in her past was buried. She has come to unearth it. Forsyth laughed nervously. Are we suggesting she's the ghost? No, Poirot said. We are suggesting someone wants us to think she is, to disguise something else, something very present and very real. He turned to Eleanor. Mademoiselle, the dreams, the laughter, the cold hands. You are not mad, but you are being led, manipulated. By whom? Eleanor whispered. Poirot's voice dropped. By someone who fears the truth, someone who believes that Elise's return will reveal a long-buried secret. Someone who once wrote a letter to Colonel Morley, long after he died. He produced the first envelope, the one found in the library. And this letter, I believe, was forged not by Elise, but by someone else, someone who had something to gain. Lady Morley spoke, her voice low. Adrian! All eyes turned to Forsyth. He raised an eyebrow. Me? That's absurd. I never knew the man. No, Poirot said, but you found something, a diary perhaps, or letters, during your research, and you realized the value in stirring the waters. Forsyth's expression darkened. This is preposterous. Poirot advanced. You were the only guest with access to the locked study, the only one with knowledge of how to forge historical documents convincingly, and the only one with a motive: curiosity, vanity, the desire to inject yourself into the family's inner life. Lady Morley rose slowly. You forged the letter? Forsyth's calm cracked. I wanted to see what would happen. That mirror, the inscription, it demands the truth. I only nudged it along. Poirot shook his head. And when that was not enough, you lit the cigarette in the east wing, created whispers, perhaps even played a child's laugh on a phonograph. But you did not expect me. There was silence. Then Forsyth exhaled, his facade crumbling. I thought she was dead. I thought bringing her back would force the family to face what they buried. Poirot looked to Lady Morley. Elise may yet live, madame. But this house has suffered enough from secrets. Tomorrow, I suggest we begin searching the Morley family records, properly. I believe the answers are waiting there. Lady Morley nodded, dazed, and the mirror, silent through it all, reflected only flickering candlelight and the long stretching shadows of truth. Chapter 5. The Chapel in the Woods. The following morning was unusually still. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. A thick fog clung to the estate, turning Morley Court into a silhouette, its chimneys and turrets floating above the white sea of mist like a castle suspended in limbo. Poirot rose early. He dressed with meticulous care as always, and placed both the confession and the forged letter into his leather portfolio. Today he had no intention of speaking in riddles. The time had come to uncover the final shadows that lay between Elise Morley and the truth. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Adrian Forsyth had left in the early hours, his belongings packed into his car, and a note left with Lady Morley's maid. I regret nothing but your disappointment. Truth will out in whatever form it chooses. Coward, Lady Morley muttered, folding the note and tucking it away. Poirot raised an eyebrow. He may yet have done us a service, madame. In unsettling the silence, he loosened the roots of deeper truths. Lady Morley stared into her teacup. Do you still believe Elise lives? Poirot did not answer immediately. I believe Elise never truly left, whether in flesh or memory. That is what I now intend to confirm. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Poirot asked to see Mrs. Weatherby once again. The housekeeper arrived in the small sitting-room off the main hall, visibly wary. You have more questions, Monsieur Poirot? Yes, madame, he said gently. Only one. Did you know Elise's mother? The question struck with precision. The old woman's face changed almost imperceptibly. Something in her eyes flickered and then steadied. I did, she said. Her name was Isabel Marston. She was a scullery maid here once, many years before Elise came to live with the Colonel. And she was close to him? Mrs. Weatherby nodded. More than was proper. There were rumours, of course, but one does not question a colonel in his own house. Isabel left suddenly. Months later, the colonel returned from India with his ward. Poirot folded his hands. And Elise was, in truth, not his goddaughter, but his illegitimate child. Mrs. Weatherby's voice dropped. Yes, everyone suspected, but it was never spoken aloud. Lady Morley accepted Elise under certain illusions. The girl was bright, but lonely. She knew something was off. Children always do. Poirot leaned forward. "And why did she leave?" Mrs. Weatherby sighed. "Because she found out. The Colonel told her one night in a fit of rage. He'd had too much port. Said things that frightened her. I found her the next morning, ghost pale, packing a satchel. She told me only one thing. If I stay, he'll make me disappear anyway." And then she vanished. "Did you ever hear from her again?" Mrs. Weatherby looked away. "Once, a postcard from Sussex. No return address. Just 4 words. I'm still watching." Poirot stood slowly. "Thank you, madame. You have helped more than you know." By midday, Poirot had assembled a small party, Lady Morley, Eleanor, Hastings, and himself, and requested they accompany him to the old family chapel at the edge of the estate. "It is not often used," Lady Morley warned. "It hasn't hosted a proper service since Geoffrey's funeral." "All the better," Poirot replied. They made their way down the mossy path that led through a thicket of beech and ash trees. The fog had begun to lift, revealing a low stone structure shrouded in ivy, its leaded windows stained with age and weather. Poirot pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the chapel was a single nave with a raised chancel. The air smelled of stone and mildew. Dust lay thick on the pews, and the altar cloth was stained by time, but the crucifix remained undisturbed. Poirot's eyes roamed the walls until he spotted it, a brass plaque beside a wooden lectern, half hidden by cobwebs. He brushed it clean. It read in memory of Isabel M. Faithfull. "To the end 1883, 1907 Lady Morley gasped. Isabel? Marston?" Poirot nodded. "This plaque was installed discreetly, perhaps without your knowledge. A quiet act of guilt, I suspect, perhaps by the Colonel himself. But it confirms the name." Eleanor stepped forward, staring at the inscription. "She died the same year Elise arrived," she said quietly. "Indeed," Poirot said, "and I think Elise knew this, or discovered it, and it shattered whatever illusion she still clung to." He turned. "Look here." He stepped behind the altar to where a low wooden panel in the wall was slightly ajar. A faint draught escaped. From it, "A hidden compartment?" Hastings asked. "May we?" Poirot knelt and opened the panel fully. Inside was a small alcove lined with stone, likely used centuries ago for storing relics or church records. But within it now was a single wrapped bundle, protected from the elements. Poirot carefully unwrapped the oilskin cloth. Inside was a journal, Elise's journal. The pages were stained with age, but the ink was still legible. Poirot began to read aloud. "I was born in shame. I live in shadow, but I will not die voiceless. He tried to silence my mother. He tried to erase me, but a house keeps secrets no matter how deep you bury them." Poirot glanced up. "There is more, but it must be read in full later. The tone, however, is clear. Elise intended her story to be found. She hid it here, knowing no one else would look." Lady Morley clutched the pew in front of her. "This house, this family," Poirot's voice was calm but firm, "has carried a lie for decades. Elise was not a ghost. She was a warning. And this journal, her voice. Do you think she's still alive?" Eleanor asked. Poirot looked at her. Thoughtfully, "I believe so. I believe she has been near." watching, perhaps even guiding. He turned toward the open chapel door. "And I believe she will come to us, if she knows the truth is no longer hidden." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast golden light across the lawn, Poirot stood once again before the engraved mirror in the drawing-room. Lady Morley, Eleanor, and Hastings were beside him. Poirot touched the inscription lightly. "What you see, you own. What you deny, you lose." He turned to the others. "This mirror has stood here for generations. It has reflected births, deaths, betrayals. It has seen lies masked in politeness and truths swallowed by silence. But now, enfin, it sees what must be seen." At that moment there was a sound, a soft knock at the front door. Lady Morley turned, startled. Clara entered the room a moment later. "There's a woman at the door, madam. Says her name is Elise." Silence fell like a stone. Poirot stepped forward. "Show her in." The woman who entered was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pinned neatly and eyes that carried the weight of years. She walked with poise, but her gaze was cautious. She wore a simple wool coat and leather gloves. Her eyes moved to Lady Morley, then to Eleanor, and finally to Poirot. "I thought I'd never return," she said. "But the mirror, someone changed what it reflected." Poirot nodded. "You hid the journal?" "Yes. After I left, I came back once. Quietly. I wanted to leave a trace. Something no one could erase." "You read the letter?" Lady Morley asked faintly. "I did. It didn't undo the pain, but it mattered." Eleanor stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Why didn't you ever write to me?" Elise gave a soft, broken smile. "Because I was afraid you'd forgotten me." "I never did." Poirot stepped back and allowed them space. Finally, Lady Morley moved forward. "I should have known, or asked more questions." "No," Elise said gently. "You gave me kindness. That's more than most." Poirot looked around the room. The fire, the mirror, the lingering stillness that now felt lifted, as if the house itself had exhaled. "Elise Morley," he said quietly, "you are no longer a shadow." And the mirror, once etched with denial and secrets, now reflected not just faces, but resolution. Chapter 6. The Return of the Heiress. The arrival of Elise Morley cast a long shadow over the remainder of the day. In the drawing-room, where secrets had hung in the air like cobwebs, the presence of the woman herself brought an uncomfortable clarity. It was as if a ghost had stepped out of a painting. Only she was real, flesh and bone, and carrying within her the weight of decades. She sat across from Lady Morley now, tea untouched in front of her, while Poirot stood between them as a kind of gentle intermediary. "I never expected you would come," Lady Morley said, her voice thin, almost strained. "I didn't expect it either," Elise replied quietly. "But then one doesn't always choose the moment when truth arrives. Sometimes it chooses you." Hastings, standing near the window, shifted uncomfortably. "It's like something out of a novel," he muttered under his breath. Poirot shot him a silencing glance. "Life, mon ami, often imitates fiction, particularly when it comes to family." Elise smiled faintly, but her eyes remained guarded. "I didn't come for revenge or inheritance. I came to see if what I remembered was still true. The house, the voices, the silence. "And are they?" Eleanor asked softly, seated nearby. "Yes," Elise replied, "even the silence." Poirot spoke gently. "You left with great pain, mademoiselle. You were young, frightened. You carried knowledge you were not meant to carry." "I carried more than that," Elise said. "I carried shame, not because of who I was, but because no one else would speak of it. I was the scandal no one wanted to name. Colonel Morley, never hit me, never mistreated me, but he made me feel invisible, as if I should be grateful to live in the house built by my own father." Lady Morley looked away. Poirot interlaced his fingers. The confession letter, the journal in the chapel, the plaque beneath Isabel Marston's name, all pieces of a puzzle you left behind. "Did you mean for them to be discovered?" Elise nodded. "Eventually. I came back once, years ago. I placed them where I thought someone might find them if they ever decided to look." "Not many would choose a chapel," Hastings said. "It was her place," Elise replied. "My mother's. She told me once that if she ever vanished, I'd find her in the silence. I didn't understand what she meant, but when I stood there again, I knew." Lady Morley finally turned her gaze on Elise. "I didn't know she was your mother. Geoffrey never told me. I only knew that she had left suddenly." "Because of me," Elise said simply. "Or rather, because of what she meant to him." There was silence, not of discomfort now, but of reflection. Poirot stood. "Now, we must discuss the matter of your return, not emotionally, but legally. There are implications, you understand." "I want nothing," Elise said firmly. "No claim to property, no title. I came only for the truth." "That may be," Poirot said, "but the law is not sentimental. Colonel Morley died intestate. The will was never updated. The house and all assets passed to Lady Morley. But if you were acknowledged as his daughter, even illegitimately, you may have a claim. I do not intend to pursue it, and yet," Lady Morley said slowly, "perhaps you should." Elise looked at her, surprised. "I mean it," Lady Morley said. "You deserve something, and if not for yourself, for what you endured, for what you've carried in silence." Elise shook her head. "That house is full of ghosts. I don't want to live in it." Poirot raised a hand gently. "May I make a suggestion, mademoiselle?" Both women looked to him. "Why not reframe the matter? Instead of inheritance, let us call it restoration. A room, perhaps, once yours, now made yours again. Not because of law or entitlement, but because it is right." Lady Morley gave a slow nod. "If Elise is willing, I'd like her to stay. There's space in the east wing, though perhaps she might prefer something brighter." "I would," Elise said, smiling faintly. "I've lived in the shadows long enough." Eleanor, who had remained silent for much of the exchange, now stood and crossed the room. She took Elise's hand in both of hers. "I don't remember much about you," she said, "but I remember feeling safe when you were near." Elise's eyes shimmered, "And I remember brushing your hair and thinking you were the only person in the house who looked at me without fear." They stood in silence, the past softening slightly between them. Later that day, Poirot walked alone through the garden. The fog had lifted entirely now, and the sun spread itself over the lawns in golden patches. The fountain, though still dry, sparkled faintly with dew. Hastings joined him near the sundial. "Well," Hastings said, "that was quite a scene. You think she'll really stay?" "I do," Poirot replied, "though not forever. She will stay until the past no longer bites at her heels. Then she will leave, not in flight, but in peace. And Lady Morley? She is a woman of pride, but also of quiet regrets. She did not know the whole truth, but she suspected. And now that she knows, she is trying to balance the scales in her own way." Hastings nodded. "Still, I'm surprised Elise didn't want the estate." Poirot smiled. "She is not interested in walls, mon ami. She is interested in closure, in the kind of justice that no solicitor can provide." They walked for a while in silence before Poirot added, "And in doing so she has returned life to this house. The mirror no longer reflects sorrow. It reflects resolution." That evening, after dinner, Elise found Poirot in the drawing-room once more. He was standing before the mirror, as he often did, arms behind his back, head tilted slightly. "I've always hated this thing," she said softly. Poirot turned. "It has seen much," he said. "And now it has seen you. Do you really believe in what it says?" Poirot read the inscription aloud once more. "What you see, you own. What you deny, you lose." "I believe, mademoiselle," he said, "that denial is the root of most sorrow. In this house, people denied your heritage, your pain, your very existence. And in doing so, they lost something precious. Truth." She nodded slowly. "I'll never forget what you did," she said. "You did it," Poirot replied. "I merely reflected it back to you." She smiled almost shyly and turned to leave. "Good night, Monsieur Poirot." "Bonsoir, mademoiselle Morley." And when she had gone, Poirot remained standing before the mirror for some time longer, watching the flicker of the candlelight and the way the glass now seemed softer somehow, less accusing. Chapter 7. The Visitor Beneath the Elm Tree. The days that followed Elise's return passed with an uneasy peace. The weather turned mild, the fog lifting entirely, revealing the autumn hues of Morley Court in full splendour. Copper-gold trees lining the drive, brittle leaves crackling underfoot, and ivy curling lazily over the grey stone walls. Lady Morley kept to her room most mornings now. Whether due to fatigue, guilt, or quiet contemplation, no one knew. Eleanor spent her time with Elise, walking the grounds or reading by the fire. The house, long burdened by the weight of unsaid things, felt lighter, though it still held its breath, as if waiting for something to finish unfolding. Poirot, meanwhile, remained quietly observant. Though the surface had smoothed, he knew the sediment of any mystery always settled in layers. Truth, in his experience, rarely came all at once. It trickled in with the persistence of rain against a sealed window. On the third day, while walking the perimeter of the property, Poirot stopped beneath a towering elm tree near the estate's northern boundary. It was a spot overgrown with brambles and nettle, where a crumbled stone bench remained half-buried beneath weeds. He'd been led there not by footsteps, but by instinct. He found a fragment of cloth snagged on a thorny branch. Fine wool, deep brown, with a faint floral embroidery at the hem. Carefully, he placed it in his pocket. Upon returning to the house, he found Hastings waiting in the study, thumbing through a local newspaper. Anything of interest? Poirot asked mildly. Only village gossip and bad poetry. Oh, and one peculiar notice. A man's been asking about someone named Marston. Claims to be a cousin from Devon, says he's come into some family documents and is trying to find a girl who would now be in her 30s. No name, just the Marston link. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Curious timing, no? Hastings nodded. Do you think it's about Elise? Almost certainly, Poirot said, which means either he is legitimate or someone has stirred the waters again. He left Hastings and went directly to the drawing-room, where Elise sat alone, a sketch-pad in her lap. May I trouble you, mademoiselle? Poirot asked. Of course, she replied, setting the pad aside. He handed her the scrap of cloth. Does this mean anything to you? She took it gently and examined it. Her expression darkened. This is from the dress I wore when I returned, years ago, to leave the journal, she said slowly. It must have torn when I passed through the bramble path. I never went back to that part of the estate after that night. So it has remained untouched, Poirot murmured. I suppose so, she said. Why? Poirot didn't reply immediately. Instead, he drew a folded clipping from his pocket and handed it to her. It was the newspaper notice Hastings had shown him. Elise read it, her face unreadable. I don't know of any cousins, she said finally, but Marston isn't an uncommon name. True, but the timing is precise. And I am always wary of coincidence. She looked up. Do you think someone's looking for me? I think, Poirot said gently, that someone may believe your return means opportunity, either for blackmail or for claims, or perhaps for something more personal. That afternoon, a letter arrived for Elise, unsigned. It had no return address, only a Devonshire postmark and a few carefully typed lines. Truth may set you free, but truth has a cost. I know who you are, and I know what he did. Shall we speak in person? The elm tree. Dusk. Eleanor, seeing the letter, grew anxious. You won't go, will you? Elise folded the paper neatly. Of course I will. Poirot nodded approvingly. Yes, you must. But you will not go alone. As dusk settled over Morley Court, the estate fell into a hush. The sky turned violet behind the western trees, and the crows gave one last caw before roosting. Poirot and Elise walked side by side through the back gardens and past the stable wall, eventually reaching the elm tree where the bench lay. A man stood waiting there. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a dark coat and flat cap. His face was thin, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that flickered restlessly. He looked startled to see Poirot, but masked it quickly. Elise, he said, giving a stiff nod. It's been a long time. She didn't respond. Poirot stepped forward. And you are? Thomas Fairley, the man said. My mother was Isabel Marston's cousin. That makes me family, I suppose. What is it you want? Elise asked coldly. Fairley spread his hands. I don't want to cause trouble, but I've come across some family papers, letters really, sent from this place to Isabel. From Geoffrey Morley. He made promises, financial ones. My mother always said Isabel was left with nothing. It seems now that debt belongs to you. There was no debt, Elise said. No promise. I beg to differ, Fairley replied smoothly. There's enough in these letters to suggest your father intended support. For Isabel, for you, but it never arrived. Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And what do you propose?" Fairly gave a smile. "A quiet settlement, let's say £5,000, in exchange for silence. Otherwise, I might have to bring this into the open. A few tabloid papers would love the tale. The fallen heiress, the Colonel's secret child, the estate tied up in legal chaos." Didn't blink. "You have no power." Perhaps not, but noise is often mistaken for power. Poirot stepped forward. "Might I see these letters?" "Not without payment." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "Then I suggest you listen carefully, because I too have a letter. One written by Colonel Morley. A confession, handwritten, signed and detailing exactly what he did to Isabel and Elise. It acknowledges guilt and abandonment. I believe the courts would find it rather compelling." Fairley's face stiffened. "In addition," Poirot continued, "you have blackmailed not merely a woman but an heir. You have made threats in writing. I believe the authorities may wish to speak with you about this. And as for those tabloid papers, I happen to have connections with the editors of the Gazette. Shall I tell them your side of the story?" Fairley's confidence faltered. "You wouldn't?" "I would," Poirot said calmly. There was silence. Then Fairley took a deep breath, reached into his coat, and handed over a thin bundle of papers. "Keep them," he said. "I've no interest in a scandal. I only wanted what was fair." He turned and walked off, vanishing into the falling dusk. Back at the house, Elise sat in the drawing-room beside the fire, reading the letters Fairley had given her. They were indeed genuine. Old yellowed pages written in Colonel Morley's hand, full of veiled regret and half-hearted promises to Isabel. They confirmed what Elise already knew, that she had been known, but never claimed. She placed them on the table beside her own journal. Lady Morley entered the room, walking slowly, a shawl over her shoulders. "You dealt with him," she said, "simply." "Elise did," Poirot said. "I merely added theatre." Lady Morley took a seat beside the hearth. "These papers? Do you intend to publish them?" "No," Elise said. "I think the truth has spoken enough." There was a pause. Then Lady Morley reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object. She handed it to Elise. It was a locket, tarnished, oval-shaped with a miniature portrait inside. Isabel Marston in profile, her features delicate and hauntingly familiar. "I found it years ago, hidden in one of Geoffrey's drawers," Lady Morley said. "I knew who she was. I didn't know what to do with it. I suppose I thought, if I held on to it, she might come back." Elise held the locket for a long time, her fingers gently brushing its surface. "She never really left," she said softly. "She's always been in this house, in the silence, in the mirror." Poirot stood once again before the engraved glass. "What you see, you own. What you deny, you lose," he read. Then he turned, satisfied. "This house has seen its truth, and the truth, as painful as it is, no longer hides." Chapter 8. What the Mirror remembers Morley Court had never been a house for laughter. It had been built for solemnity, for lineage, for tradition. But as Elise Morley passed through its long, echoing halls the next morning, there was a kind of stillness that felt new, not oppressive, but clean. The truth, like a storm finally spent, had left a quieter landscape behind. Poirot rose early that day, not with his usual appetite for symmetry or his dandyish precision, but with a sense that the end of this story was drawing near, and yet something small still eluded him. Downstairs, the household was beginning to shift. Eleanor was packing, her suitcase for a short return to London. Lady Morley had ordered the East Wing cleaned and aired, a symbolic gesture as much as a practical one. Elise herself had taken a room facing the orchard, sunlit and far from the room where she had once lived in silence. At breakfast, she joined Poirot alone. "I'm still not used to this," she said softly, buttering toast she wouldn't eat. "Being allowed to sit here, openly," Poirot smiled gently. "To be acknowledged is no small thing, mademoiselle, but you must also allow yourself to feel it." "I know," she replied, "but habits, especially the quiet ones, die harder than lies." There was a pause. Poirot stirred his coffee. "Do you plan to stay?" he asked. Elise looked out the window. "I think so, at least for now. There's a great deal still to read in the chapel. The journals, my mother's things, and someone should remain here to remember her." Poirot nodded. "And the legal matters. I'll sign whatever Lady Morley chooses. I don't want to contest. I want to belong, not own. You are wise." Hesitated, then reached into her pocket and placed a small object on the table. The locket. Isabel's portrait shone faintly from behind its scratched glass. "I want this kept here," Elise said, "in the chapel, beside the plaque. It's where it belongs." Later that morning, Poirot met with Lady Morley in the study. The old room, with its leather-bound books and green-shaded desk lamp, still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and furniture wax. On the desk lay a new will, freshly drafted and awaiting signatures. "I've asked my solicitor to include Elise as a co-heir," Lady Morley said without looking up. 50% of what remains. No contest, no conditions." Poirot studied her. "That is very generous, madame." "Not generosity," she said coldly. "Justice, or perhaps repentance." Poirot nodded. "You were fond of Geoffrey, were you not?" Lady Morley's face hardened. "He was my husband." "That is not what I asked." She sighed, her fingers tightening around her pen. "I loved the man I thought he was. The soldier, the gentleman, the provider. But over time, I realized that the man I loved had rooms in his soul I would never be allowed to enter. Elise came from one of those rooms." "And yet you have welcomed her. She belongs here more than I do." Poirot offered a rare, sincere bow of respect. Outside, in the East Garden, Hastings joined Elise for a short walk. The garden, wild with ivy and bluebells, had grown unruly over the years, but Elise found comfort in its disorder. "It's hard to imagine you in London," Hastings said casually. "You seem so rooted here now." "I suppose I've spent most of my life being invisible," she said. "Now that I've been seen, I want to stay in the light a while." Hastings smiled. "Poirot says the hardest mysteries are not the murders or the thefts, but the people who vanish without leaving." Elise stopped beside a sundial. "I didn't mean to vanish. I just dissolved. There's a difference." Hastings looked at her thoughtfully. "Not any more." Later that afternoon, Poirot returned once more to the drawing-room, the heart of Morley Court's sorrow. The fire had not been lit. Instead, A shaft of sunlight came through the tall windows and struck the engraved mirror directly. He stood before it, alone. For a long while, he simply stared at the inscription. What you see, you own. What you deny, you lose. Then, for the first time, he removed his gloves and placed his fingertips gently on the glass. "Let us see, mon vieux," he whispered. "Have you shown all there is to show?" His eyes flicked over the surface. No distortion, no ghostly images, just his reflection. And yet there was something odd about the frame itself. An irregularity. A small engraving on the lower left corner, so fine it could be mistaken for a scratch. He leaned closer. It was a symbol. 2 interlocked letters. I am Isabel Marston. Poirot's eyebrows rose. He pressed gently against the base of the frame, and heard a faint click. The wooden backing of the mirror shifted slightly, revealing a shallow compartment. Inside it lay a folded piece of paper and a small photograph. He removed them both. The photograph was old and faded, Isabel holding a child on her lap, seated in the same east garden Elise had walked that morning. The child's face was half-turned, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The note was brief. "If you ever look closely enough, you will find me. I placed this here not for Geoffrey, not for the household, but for her, for Elise. If she finds it, she will know I saw her, that I loved her, that I fought, even in silence." I am Poirot stared at the note, deeply moved. Then, folding it carefully, he slipped both items into his pocket. The mirror had remembered. That evening, as the house sat beneath the weight of the setting sun, Poirot gathered the household one final time in the drawing-room. Lady Morley, Eleanor, Elise, Hastings, they sat quietly as Poirot stood before the mirror, composed and calm. "There is one final truth to share," he began, a final voice yet to be heard. He produced the photograph and the note. "This mirror, which has borne witness to denial, now offers proof of love. Hidden in its frame was a final message from Isabel Marston." He passed the note to Elise, who read it silently. Her hands trembled. "It's her," she whispered. "It's her handwriting." "Yes," Poirot said. "She placed it there for you, knowing it may never be found. But love, mademoiselle, has patience." Lady Morley looked away, her throat tight. Poirot continued, "It is fitting, I think, that the very object used to distort and suppress truth now offers its restoration." He turned to the mirror once more. "You are no longer a weapon," he said softly, as if to the glass. "You are a window." No one spoke for a long while. Then Elise stood, crossed the room, and placed the locket, her mother's, gently at the base of the mirror. A gesture of peace. A conclusion. As night fell, Poirot and Hastings stood once more on the gravel drive, their bags packed, a car waiting under the archway of the gatehouse. "You've done it again," Hastings said. "Though I must admit, I rather missed the murder." Poirot gave a rare chuckle. "Murder is easy, mon ami. Silence is harder." "And what now?" Poirot glanced back toward the house. "Elise will heal. Lady Morley will age with more grace. And the mirror, the mirror, it will remain. But now it reflects not secrets, but survival." The wind shifted slightly, lifting the leaves in a swirl. As they climbed into the car and pulled away from Morley Court, The house stood bathed in warm gold, its windows aglow, and the garden whispering, only softly in the autumn air. The past had spoken, the present had listened, and the future at last waited with open arms. Chapter 9. The Echo After Silence. A week had passed since Hercule Poirot's final discovery behind the mirror. In that time Morley Court began, in its own quiet way, to transform. The days were no longer filled with heavy silences and carefully avoided glances. The staff moved more freely. Lady Morley emerged from her solitude, taking lunch in the garden or reading near the library hearth. And Elise Morley, once a ghost in her own history, now walked the grounds with purpose. The house no longer resisted her presence. It had accepted her, as if its bricks and beams had finally sighed with relief. Poirot had delayed his departure longer than usual, content to observe the unfolding peace and the human details that often escaped others. The way Eleanor leaned into Elise when they spoke, like a child finding an older sister again. The faint smile that now curled at Lady Morley's lips when she looked across the breakfast table. "I dare say this is the first house I've known," Poirot mused to Hastings one morning, "where the solving of a mystery did not end in prison, but in something softer, something redemptive." "It's rather a new experience," Hastings admitted. "Most of our adventures end with handcuffs or heartbreak. Not every crime is a matter for Scotland Yard," Poirot said, adjusting his cuffs. "Some are older than the law, crimes of silence, of exclusion." Hastings gave a small nod. "So what happens now?" "Now, mon ami, now comes the echo. It came, first, in the form of letters. One addressed to Elise, bearing the crest of a legal firm in London. Another to Lady Morley, sealed with a wax stamp that looked distinctly aristocratic. And a third, rather unexpectedly, to Poirot himself. They gathered in the drawing-room to open them. Lady Morley began. Her letter was brief and businesslike. The Marston estate, Isabel's childhood home, had passed through probate without heirs for years. Upon Elise's confirmation of her parentage, the firm had moved to recognise her claim. The cottage in Devon, though modest and weather-worn, was hers. "She has a place," Lady Morley said softly, handing the letter to Elise. "Not because she asked for it, but because she was denied it for so long." Elise read it with a steady hand. "I don't know if I want it." "You don't have to want it," Lady Morley replied, "but you deserve to choose." Poirot opened his letter last. It was from the editor of the Gazette, thanking him discreetly for passing on the name of Thomas Fairley, who had now been arrested on charges of extortion in another inheritance case near Bath. Fairley's blackmail scheme, it seemed, had been neither unique nor especially clever, but it had found an unusually satisfying end thanks to Poirot's quiet tip-off. "Another villain unmasked," Hastings muttered, "even if it wasn't done with a dramatic flourish." "Justice rarely flourishes," Poirot replied. "It simply endures." In the following days, Elise and Eleanor began cataloguing the chapel's contents. What had once been a makeshift hiding place was now treated with reverence. The journals Elise had left behind were sorted, read, and, after discussion with Lady Morley, donated to the local historical society under pseudonym. Her story, while deeply personal, became part of a broader tale of lineage, inheritance, and women written out of history. Poirot visited the chapel one last time alone. There, beside the plaque to Isabel Marston, sat the locket and the note he'd retrieved from the mirror. He placed a small flower on the stone sill. "You were wise, madame," he murmured. "You did not shout. You waited, and now your daughter speaks." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and Poirot fancied the air felt warmer than it had all month. On the evening before Poirot and Hastings were to leave, Lady Morley hosted a quiet supper. A gesture of gratitude, she said, though everyone knew it was something more. It was a farewell. They dined in the smaller parlour, where the conversation turned to art, books, and Eleanor's plans to return to her London flat. She would take up a part-time post in an art gallery, a suggestion Elise had encouraged, noting how Eleanor's eye for beauty deserved to be shared beyond the dusty halls of Morley Court. Lady Morley made one final toast. "To memory," she said, "to truth, and to the people who refused to let them fade." Afterward, when the fire had dimmed and the last glass of sherry had been drained, Elise found Poirot in the drawing-room once more, standing, unsurprisingly, before the engraved mirror. "Still watching it?" she asked. "Always," Poirot said. "It is not merely a mirror. It is a witness." Elise stepped beside him. "I used to think it hated me." "No," Poirot said. "It simply reflected what you were made to feel." She looked at her reflection. Older now, wiser, no longer the child pressed into invisibility. "And what do you think it shows now?" Poirot tilted his head. "A woman who survived?" She turned to him. "I never thanked you." "There is no need." "There is," she insisted. "You believed me. You looked where no one else would." Poirot gave a modest smile. "It is my vocation, mademoiselle, to see what others miss, to listen for the silence beneath the noise." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you think we ever truly move on? Or do we just learn to live with what remains?" Poirot considered this for a long moment. Then he said softly, "I think we do not move on. We absorb. We carry it, fold it within ourselves, and if we are fortunate, we find people who help us carry it better." Elise nodded. "That sounds true." Poirot looked once more at the mirror, then turned from it. "It is no longer needed," he said. "Let it hang, let it watch, but let it not command." He offered her a final bow. "Good night, Mademoiselle Morley." She smiled. "Good night, Monsieur Poirot." The next morning, Hastings and Poirot departed early. The air was crisp, the leaves gold and red beneath their feet, and the carriage packed lightly for the return to London. As they passed the gate, Hastings glanced back at the house. "I never thought a case without murder could be so heavy." Poirot nodded. "The wounds of the heart, Hastings, bleed more quietly, but far deeper." Hastings sighed. "Will you ever tell me why you stayed so long this time?" Poirot didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, "Because I, too, once needed someone to believe in what I saw." Hastings glanced at him, puzzled, but Poirot only smiled, folded his hands across his lap, and said no more. Behind them, Morley Court faded from view, but not from memory. For in its windows now lived light, and in its mirror a truth that would no longer hide. Chapter 10. The etching beneath the silver London in November suited Poirot perfectly. The city was brisk but civilized, orderly in its chaos. The carriages and motors that clogged Piccadilly were a nuisance, but a familiar one. The fog that blanketed the street lamps in the evening seemed to him less a hindrance than a kind of veil, behind which things could be understood at a slower, more deliberate pace. Poirot and Hastings had returned to their shared flat on a quiet corner of Clarges Street. Hastings had quickly resumed his usual habits: pacing, newspaper scanning, and the occasional exasperated declaration that Poirot ought to write his memoirs at last. Poirot, meanwhile, had spent the days since their return in his study, surrounded by files, correspondences, and most recently, a brown parcel that had arrived from Devon. It was marked simply, "To Monsieur Hercule Poirot," a final piece of the truth. There was no signature. He opened it privately, carefully. Inside were three things: a copy of Isabel Marston's death certificate, a page torn from an old parish register, and a drawing, sketched in pencil, folded twice, of a mirror, not any mirror. The mirror, the one from Morley Court. But it wasn't how it looked now. The frame was different, less ornate, more raw. The engraving was missing, and beneath the sketch, in small, almost illegible script, were the words, "The original frame." Replaced. Why? And by whom? Poirot sat back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, "have we been looking at the end of the story, when we should have looked at its beginning?" Later that evening, Poirot called Hastings into the study. "What do you make of this?" he asked, handing him the drawing and note. Hastings studied it with his usual puzzlement. "It's that mirror again, isn't it? But it's not the one we saw at Morley Court." "Just so. This appears to be a sketch of the mirror as it once was, before the engraving. Then someone altered it?" Poirot nodded. "Oui. And what do we know about mirrors, Hastings?" "That they reflect what's in front of them?" Poirot gave a small smile. "Philosophically true, but practically they also reflect what is behind. Who owned them? Who shaped them? In this case, we assumed the mirror had always belonged to the Morleys, that it was a Morley heirloom, carved by one of Elise's ancestors. And it wasn't?" Poirot tapped the corner of the drawing. "Isabel Marston was the daughter of a cabinet-maker in Devon. The parish record here, see? He lists her father, Matthew Marston, as woodworker of ecclesiastical objects. He built pulpits, choir stalls, decorative altars." So, Poirot said, rising. "What if the mirror was hers before it ever belonged to Morley Court?" Hastings frowned. "But why would it end up there?" Poirot crossed to the window, his voice low. "Because Colonel Geoffrey Morley took it, after her death. A private relic, a souvenir of a woman he'd never truly claimed but couldn't forget. And he had the engraving added himself." Hastings blinked. Then that quote, "What you see, you own. What you deny, you lose." It wasn't an old family motto. Poirot turned. "No, Hastings. It was his confession." The next morning, Poirot wrote a discreet letter to Lady Morley, enclosing a copy of the drawing and his conclusions. He asked nothing of her, save one favour: to confirm, quietly, whether any local craftsman had ever been employed by Colonel Morley to alter a mirror frame. Specifically in the spring of 1907, the reply came within a week: yes. The frame was altered by a woodworker from Ivycombe in May 1907. Geoffrey never explained why. I believed it was to hide a crack in the wood. You now suggest it was to bury something deeper. And beneath, in Lady Morley's careful script, we shall remove the mirror. It has watched enough. Poirot folded the letter and closed his eyes. For a moment, the case, he felt, was now truly complete. In the days that followed, Poirot gave himself over to the quiet rituals of order and reflection. He cleaned his desk meticulously. He organized his case notes into a single leather-bound volume. And then, one rainy afternoon, he sat beside the fireplace and opened a small black notebook labelled Private Cases, Not for Publication. In it, he began to write. The clue in the engraved mirror was not a case of murder, and yet it bore all the markings of violence, a life erased, a name hidden, a legacy forged in silence. But silence, like glass, eventually cracks, and when it does, it reflects the truth most clearly. Elise Morley did not seek justice in courtrooms. She sought acknowledgment, and found it. Lady Morley, too, faced her own reflection. She did not look away. But most fascinating of all was the mirror itself, not just for what it showed, but for what it concealed. For years it hung in that drawing-room, watching generations pass beneath its gaze. They believed it old, family, permanent, but it was neither. It was a stranger in the house, a stolen artifact, a shrine disguised as decor. Colonel Morley left no will, but he left that mirror, and in its inscription he carved not a motto, but a warning to himself, for he had owned a woman's love, then denied it, and in the end he lost both her and their daughter. What he saw, he had once owned. What he denied, he lost forever. Poirot paused his pen, then added one final line. Truth, when etched, does not fade, not even in glass. That evening, Hastings returned from a dinner with old army friends and found Poirot sitting by the fire, a small smile playing at the edges of his mouth. "You're looking pleased," Hastings said, hanging his coat. "I am content," Poirot replied, "which is rarer. Sit, mon ami." Hastings obeyed, pouring himself a drink. "Anything left unsolved?" "No," Poirot said, but something finally understood. He tapped the notebook gently. "There is a kind of case, Hastings, which the police do not touch and which the world forgets. Cases of the soul, of memory. They are messy, unwritten, but they shape people more than any headline ever could. And that's what this was?" "Yes," Poirot said, "a murder of identity and a resurrection." Hastings took a sip of whiskey. "You never said what you'll do with the journal Elise kept, or the photo of Isabelle." Poirot smiled. "They will go to Elise. She may someday have children. Let them know their story did not begin in a mirror, but was saved by one." They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling softly. Outside, the rain painted streaks on the glass. Inside, Hercule Poirot closed the black notebook, placed it gently on the mantelpiece, and allowed himself, at last, to rest. Chapter 11. The mirror in the sunlight spring returned to Devon slowly, like a careful guest. It brought with it blossoms on hedgerows, damp soil rich with new growth, and days that stretched longer into the evening light. Along a narrow country road, between twin fields of wild mustard and elder, sat a modest stone cottage with ivy curling up its porch and bluebells nodding along the path. This was the Marston cottage, now Elise Morley's. 3 months had passed since Poirot closed the final chapter on the engraved mirror. In that time, Elise had quietly accepted the transfer of the cottage through legal channels, though she had not moved in until the first warmth of April. She arrived with no great fanfare, only a suitcase, a trunk of letters and journals, and the locket around her neck. The village of Ivycombe welcomed her with mild curiosity, but no resistance. Many remembered Isabel. Some even remembered the girl who used to visit as a child. Though they'd never known her name, now they did. Elise had begun to make a life, quiet, deliberate hers. She taught part-time at the village school, ran a history club for the local children, and kept the cottage filled with sunlight and fresh flowers. Most mornings she walked the hillside and returned with leaves pressed between pages of old books. Some evenings she wrote journal entries, fragments of essays, letters never sent, and once a week she returned to Morley Court. It was not obligation that brought her back, but something gentler. Eleanor had taken up full residence again. Her gallery position in London offered to another, and the two women had grown close. Lady Morley, in turn, had undergone what Elise privately called a quiet unfreezing. She was not soft, but she was no longer cold. She asked questions, she remembered birthdays, and once she surprised Elise with an old sketch of Isabel, taken from a locked drawer. But the mirror was gone, removed by Lady Morley's order, and placed at Poirot's recommendation in the care of a museum in Totnes that specialized in personal objects from private estates. It was displayed simply behind glass, with a short label, The Mirror from Morley Court, c. 1900-1907, believed to contain an original posthumous engraving by Colonel Geoffrey Morley, dedicated anonymously to the memory of I. M. Elise, had visited it only once since. She had not cried. She had only stood before it, watching her reflection as the words beneath it shimmered faintly in the museum lights. What you see, you own. What you deny, you lose. She had smiled, not sadly, but firmly, and then she'd turned and walked back. Into the daylight. Hercule Poirot, meanwhile, was once again fully ensconced in London. His reputation had suffered no decline. Indeed, the Morley matter had reached whispered corners of the social sphere, and there were those who suspected he had solved a scandal too delicate for headlines. He had returned to his routines, his morning chocolate, his measured walks in Hyde Park, his carefully arranged files. But there was a new softness in his manner when speaking of Devon, a certain fondness, as if the entire county had wrapped around him like a memory he chose to keep close. One afternoon in early May, he received a small package at his residence. The writing was familiar, precise, clear, Elise's. Inside was a pressed bluebell, a folded letter, and a photograph. The letter read, Monsieur Poirot, I thought you might like to know that the mirror has not been replaced. In its place now hangs a painting. Eleanor's. It's of the orchard in spring. There is no inscription beneath it. But we've agreed to frame it with a single phrase. Nothing hidden, nothing lost. I don't think we could have reached that without you." With all my thanks, Elise Poirot placed the photograph beside the bluebell. It was of the orchard indeed. Pale pink blossoms, gold light through the trees, and two women seated in its centre, one painting, the other watching. He smiled. Later that evening, Hastings returned from a brief holiday in Bath, full of energetic observations and stories about poor trout fishing, slow trains, and overcooked lamb. Poirot listened with patient amusement. Then, over a cup of tea, he handed Hastings the bluebell. "From Elise," he said simply. Hastings looked at it. "She's doing well, then?" "Très bien," Poirot said. "She has found peace. Not many do after what she went through." "No," Poirot agreed, "but she did not survive by vengeance. She survived by grace." Hastings gave a slow nod. "You were right about that mirror, you know. I never trusted it." "It was never about the mirror, Hastings. Only what it reflected." There was a pause. Then Poirot added, almost to himself, "I wonder how many other homes carry such objects. Quietly waiting, holding unspoken truths. You think every old house has a mystery." Poirot smiled faintly. "Every house has shadows, most are harmless, but a few become part of the walls." Weeks later, in Totnes, a quiet young woman named Sarah Evans, an archivist at the museum, was cataloguing the mirror from Morley Court. She had studied the inscription, photographed the etching, and created preservation documents. But something still puzzled her. The engraving itself was unusually shallow, almost as if it had been meant not to last. And beneath the silvering, in the corner opposite the known IM initials, she noticed a faint distortion, a shimmer, a ripple in the backing. She alerted her supervisor. With permission, they delicately removed the backing for conservation. Behind the glass was not just wood, it was paper, a single folded page, yellowed and brittle, sealed with wax. On it, one line in fading ink. "For my daughter. If the house will not name you, I will. GM it had never been opened." The museum, uncertain of its ownership, sent it to Morley Court for consideration. Lady Morley received it in silence, then passed it without a word to Elise. She opened it in the orchard, beneath Eleanor's painting. Inside was a birth certificate. Name of child, Elise Isabel Marston. Father, Geoffrey Morley. Mother, Isabel Marston. Date of birth, 2nd of February 1892. Place, Ivycombe. Elise held it in her hands for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the mirror's old place in the house, and whispered, "You did know me." And this time the silence felt like agreement. Chapter 12. The garden gate closed June came to Morley Court, with a serenity the house had not known in decades. Where once the ivy-covered stone walls had seemed weighed down by secrets and silence, they now stood graceful in the summer air, softened by honeysuckle and the laughter of a house no longer haunted. Lady Morley had resumed her morning tea in the east garden, her shawl gently folded over one arm. She did not speak much of the past now, though her glances toward the orchard were more frequent, and her tone softer when she addressed the staff. To most, she seemed unchanged, a woman of dignity, reserve, and order. But to those who had watched closely, she was altered in subtle ways. She listened more. Her instructions came with pleases, and her silences no longer chilled. Elise now lived partly at Morley Court, and partly in her inherited Devon cottage. It was not indecision, but dual, belonging. She taught twice a week at Ivycombe, and spent the rest of her time restoring old village records, documenting the forgotten, the misplaced, and the misnamed. Her work brought her peace. Her time at Morley Court brought her something rarer: reconciliation. The orchard had become her refuge. A bench now sat beneath the largest apple tree, a new one, carved with initials IMGEM, her tribute to the mother who had never been permitted to speak her truth. The locket rested inside a small case in the chapel, beside the birth certificate retrieved from behind the mirror, and beside that rested a new plaque, one carved with Lady Morley's full blessing, Elise Isabel Marston Morley, daughter. Witness air, the mirror itself remained in Totnes, behind museum glass. Neither Elise nor Eleanor had visited it again. As Eleanor said with a shrug one warm afternoon, "It doesn't matter any more. It no longer has anything to show us." But they kept a small replica in the house, frameless, undecorated. Elise insisted on it, and when asked why, she simply said, not to reflect the past, only the present. Hercule Poirot returned one final time in late June. The invitation had been simple, Elise's handwriting on soft cream paper. Monsieur Poirot, we are having a gathering at Morley Court in a fortnight, our first since everything changed. We would be honoured if you would. Join us, no cases. No puzzles, just a garden and some peace. With affection, Elise Poirot arrived precisely on time, Hastings in tow, both men dressed in crisp summer linen and straw hats. Hastings rather pleased with himself for finally finding a tie to match his socks. The gathering was small and intimate. Eleanor, Lady Morley, two of Elise's school colleagues, and a local historian from Ivycombe, who had taken interest in the chapel restoration. There was lemonade served beneath a cream-coloured canopy, scones passed on silver trays, and an unexpected liveliness to the old house. "Feels like a wedding," Hastings murmured. "No," Poirot said with a smile. "Weddings are beginnings. This is something else. This is a laying down of burdens." During the afternoon, Eleanor performed a short violin piece in the drawing-room. Lady Morley, seated stiffly in the corner, dabbed at her eyes once. Elise, beside Poirot, listened with her eyes closed. After the performance, Elise took Poirot on a short walk through the orchard. "I've thought a great deal about what happened," she said. "Not just the case, not the discovery, but the mirror itself." "Ah," Poirot said, "you still reflect on it." She smiled. "I do, but not the way I used to. For years I thought that mirror had power, that it held something ancient and cruel. Now I think it simply reflected what we were unwilling to face." Poirot nodded. "Like all mirrors. Useless until someone dares to look in." They stopped beneath the tree with the new carving. "I have something for you," Elise said, reaching into a cloth satchel. She handed him a bound booklet. Leather cover, simple title, "The Girl in the Mirror, a Private Record." "My story," she said, "written carefully, respectfully, for myself and maybe someday others, but I'd like you to have the first copy." Poirot took it with rare reverence. "Merci, mademoiselle. I am honoured." She looked around the orchard where children had once played, where her father had walked without ever calling her his daughter, and now where the trees bore her initials. "I no longer need to prove anything," she said, "and I no longer need to ask why." Poirot regarded her quietly. "Then you are free." She nodded. "Yes, finally." That evening, before departing, Poirot made his final visit to the chapel. It was still cool inside, still scented with stone and old wood, but something in its air had lightened. The plaque glinted faintly in the candlelight. The locket caught it too, golden and quiet. He stood for a while, then bowed gently as one might in a sanctuary. Outside, Hastings waited beside the car. "Ready?" Poirot nodded. "Quite." As the car pulled away, Morley Court faded into the distance, framed by dusk. Lights in the upper windows blinked on. Welcoming, warm, no longer watchers of secrets but companions to peace. In London, weeks later, Poirot completed his private journal entry on the case. He sealed it with his usual precision and filed it under unpublished accounts, resolved. But he added a footnote to this one. Some cases end in the courtroom, others in confession. But this one ended in forgiveness. It began with a mirror, but not with vanity, with memory, with pain etched in glass. And when it was finally taken down, it did not break. It was at last released. And beneath it, one final sentence. Not all truths must be shouted. Some only need to be seen. He closed the book, and with that, the garden gate of Morley Court closed not with force, but with the gentlest sound. A click, a breath, a leaf brushing stone. Not an ending, a peace. Chapter 13. The garden gate closed had come quietly to Morley Court, bringing with it a gentle serenity the old estate had not known for decades. The ivy that once seemed to clutch at the stone walls with desperate fingers now clung gracefully, softened by the warm sunlight and the sweet scent of honeysuckle. The gardens, which had lain neglected beneath years of shadow and silence, were now alive with the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional laughter drifting across the lawns. Lady Morley sat alone in the east garden that morning, a delicate shawl draped lightly over one arm. Her gaze lingered on the orchard beyond, where the sunlight filtered through the branches in pale golds and greens. It was as if the house itself was breathing in the light after holding its breath for so long. To the casual observer, she appeared unchanged, dignified, reserved, a woman still wrapped tightly in her own pride and memories. But those who watched more closely could see the subtle shifts, her softened tone when speaking to the staff, the small smiles she allowed herself when no one was looking, the occasional pause that suggested contemplation rather than coldness. Elise Morley had taken to living between two worlds. Half of her days were spent at Morley Court, the house that had once tried to erase her very existence. The other half she spent in the cottage she had inherited in Devon, a modest stone building wrapped in ivy and nestled between fields of bluebells and wild mustard. It was not hesitation that caused this divided life, but a slow acceptance of belonging in two places, one of her past and one of her future. In Ivy Combe, Elise had begun to weave herself into the fabric of the village. She taught history at the local school part-time, organizing a club where children could explore the stories of their surroundings encouraging them to ask questions long ignored by the grown-ups. Her days were filled with dusty archives, old village records, and the quiet joy of reconnecting with forgotten names and places. In the evenings, she wrote letters she never sent, journal entries that mapped the journey of a life reclaimed from silence. Yet she returned to Morley Court weekly, drawn not by obligation, but by something gentler. Eleanor had settled back into the house permanently, having relinquished her London gallery post. The two women had forged a bond, one born of shared history, secrets told, and sorrows eased by understanding. Lady Morley herself had changed, emerging from the cocoon of grief and regret into a woman learning to carry her past without allowing it to dominate her present. The orchard had become Elise's refuge. Under the largest apple tree, a new bench had been placed, freshly carved with the intertwined initials IM and EM, a simple tribute to the mother who had never spoken her truth aloud, and the daughter who had finally been heard. Inside the chapel, the locket that once rested quietly in Elise's palm now lay within a small, locked case beside the birth certificate, safely accompanied by a new plaque that bore Lady Morley's formal blessing. Elise Isabel Marston Morley, daughter, witness, heir. The mirror, the old engraved mirror that had borne silent witness to so much pain, remained far from the house, preserved behind glass in a museum in Totnes. Neither Elise nor Eleanor had visited it again. As Eleanor had said with a shrug one warm afternoon, "It doesn't matter any more. It no longer has anything to show us." Yet a small unadorned replica hung quietly in Morley Court, a frameless, undecorated glass reflecting the present rather than the past. Elise had insisted on it. When asked why, she answered simply, not to reflect the past, only the present. Hercule Poirot returned to Morley Court one last time in late June. The invitation came on delicate cream paper, Elise's handwriting clear and elegant. "Monsieur Poirot, we are having a small gathering in the gardens, a first since everything changed. We would be honoured if you would join us. No puzzles, no cases, just peace." With affection, Elise Poirot arrived precisely on time, accompanied by Captain Hastings. Both men were dressed in crisp summer linen and straw hats, a rare occasion for the usually immaculately tailored detective. Hastings seemed particularly pleased to have found a tie that matched his socks. The gathering was intimate. Eleanor, Lady Morley, two of Elise's colleagues from the village school, and a local historian from Ivy Combe who had taken an interest in the chapel's restoration. Lemonade was served beneath a cream-coloured canopy, and silver trays passed around scones and finger sandwiches. The atmosphere held a curious liveliness, something neither wholly festive nor sombre, but a celebration of survival. "It feels like a wedding," Hastings murmured quietly to Poirot as they watched Eleanor prepare to play her violin. "No," Poirot replied with a smile. "Weddings mark beginnings. This is something different, a laying down of burdens." Eleanor's music filled the drawing room, the same room where so many secrets had once lived like ghosts. Lady Morley sat stiffly in the corner, dabbing at her eyes discreetly, while Elise closed her eyes, letting the melodies wash over her. After the performance, Elise invited Poirot for a quiet walk through the orchard. "I've thought a great deal about all that's happened," she said softly, eyes fixed on the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. Not just the case, the discoveries, or the mirror itself, but what it all meant, what it meant to me. Poirot nodded. "Ah, you still reflect on it?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, but not as I once did. For years I believed that mirror held power, ancient and cruel. Now, I think, it simply reflected what we refused to face. Like all mirrors," Poirot agreed, "useless until someone dares to look within." They stopped beneath the apple tree where the bench rested. "I have something for you," Elise said, reaching into a cloth satchel. She handed him a bound booklet. Leather-bound, simple title, embossed in gold. "The Girl in the Mirror, a Private Record." "My story," she explained. "Written carefully, respectfully. For myself. And maybe someday for others. But I wanted you to have the first copy." Poirot accepted it with rare reverence. "Merci, mademoiselle. I am honoured." She looked around the orchard, the place where children had once played, where her father had walked without calling her his daughter, and where the trees now bore her initials. "I no longer need to prove anything," she said quietly, "and I no longer need to ask why." Poirot regarded her quietly. "Then you are free." "Yes, finally," she whispered. That evening, before departing, Poirot made one final visit to the chapel. The air inside was cool and still, tinged with the familiar scent of stone and old wood. The plaque glinted faintly in the candlelight. The locket rested quietly, golden and serene. He stood for a long moment, then bowed gently, as one might in a sanctuary. Outside, Hastings waited by the car. "Ready?" Poirot nodded. "Quite." As the car pulled away, Morley Court faded into the distance, framed by dusk. Lights blinked on in the upper windows, welcoming and warm. No longer watchers of secrets, but companions to peace. Back in London, weeks later, Poirot sat in his study, completing his private journal entry on the case. He sealed the leather-bound volume with meticulous care and filed it under unpublished accounts, resolved. But he added a footnote to this one. Some cases end in courtrooms, others in confession, but this one ended in forgiveness. It began with a mirror, not with vanity, but with memory, with pain etched in glass. And when the mirror was finally taken down, it did not break. It was, at last, released. Beneath it he added one final sentence. "Not all truths must be shouted. Some only need to be seen." He closed the book. With that, the garden gate of Morley Court closed not with force, but with the gentlest sound. A click, a breath, a leaf brushing stone. Not an ending, a peace. The story of Morley Court was no longer one of secrets and shadows. It had become a tale of healing, of stories finally told, of lives reclaimed from silence. Elise had found her place in the world, not through wealth or title, but through truth and belonging. Lady Morley, once bound by pride and grief, had learned to soften her gaze, to embrace the complexities of love and loss. Eleanor had discovered strength in remembering, and friendship in forgiveness. And Poirot, ever the observer, had been reminded once again that the deepest mysteries often lie not in murder, but in the quiet spaces between words, in the silences that echo long after the noise fades. Morley Court, with its engraved mirror, and whispered past had finally breathed free. And in its windows now lived light. In its gardens, laughter, and in its heart, a truth that would no longer hide.